Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in downtown Washington, D.C. at the headquarters of the Center for Strategic and International Studies to talk to Dr. Michael Green, who's the Japan chair here, and one of the finest minds looking at the trans-Pacific relationship between the United States and Japan. Michael, President Trump spent a very, very interesting, very historic in some respects, obviously the first head of state meeting, for example, the new Japanese emperor had with an American president. What did the president get right on this trip? What was, from your standpoint, a little more problematic?
Well, I think Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan will be quite happy with this visit. I mean, the U.S. press picked up on all the little Trumpy mistakes that our president makes. And I do have to say I grade a little bit on a curve when President Trump goes to an allied capital, because when he goes to Europe, it often goes poorly. But it didn't go poorly. It went quite well. And the Japanese government and Trump's own team in the White House did a very good job staging 4 days of pageantry that the president enjoyed. Having worked in the White House as the senior Asia director for President Bush, you want the president to have a good time on these trips. It's generally good for your career trajectory. And you want him to go back next time. And they'd be quite pleased in the White House because the pageantry really was well orchestrated for the president to have fun, not inconsequential, but to show how strong the alliance is. The Japanese, frankly, were worried about Donald Trump, like everyone, but for a bit different reasons than the Europeans. They were worried that he was a guy who was inclined to get along with his enemies, that his best friends were going to be the authoritarian leaders of the world, including Xi Jinping of China. And the Japanese were quite worried about real estate deals involving Chinese money and all the rest. Abe personally put a huge amount of effort into making sure he and Trump had a good relationship, and it paid off because it showed that the president buys into his own government strategy for Asia, which is the so-called free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, a concept written in Japan that says the maritime democracies are going to stick together and counterbalance and deal with the rise of China based on our common values. That's exactly what Japan wanted out of this president, and his whole trip projected that. So big points for the pageantry, the show of solidarity with Japan. I think Abe would be happy also that the president dropped a lot of his threats. He had threatened to put Section 232 tariffs on Japanese autos, which would have been devastating for Abe going into an election in July for the upper house of the Japanese Diet, but also for the alliance. It would have just been a real blow, and he didn't do it. He actually gave Abe more time to work on a bilateral trade deal. He had threatened to demand, and reportedly had demanded, internally at least, that our allies, or key allies, pay 100% of the cost of basing U.S. troops, plus a 50% markup, like it's a Newark, New Jersey real estate deal or something. Completely untenable for Japan, Korea, the other allies, Germany being asked to do this. Apparently didn't come up, didn't press it. So there was no bad stuff, and the good stuff was good. I think where the president fell short was, frankly, the way he just attacked Joe Biden, attacked Mueller. He played his domestic tweeting game in Japan, and foreign policy should end, begin, whatever, at the water's edge. I mean, it was unseemly. The Japanese brushed it off, but it did not project a unified, strong America to the world. It was unfortunate. I thought that was problem.
You're so old-fashioned that way.
I know. I sort of believe in one team, one voice, but that was unfortunate. The fact that the president did not move forward with the trade deal was good in the sense that his demands were quite unreasonable. But we have no trade deal as a result. There's no progress for farmers, especially cattlemen, pork exporters, who are suffering badly because of the tariffs China's put back on us in retaliation for our tariffs on them, and because the Japanese have trade deals now with Europe and with the rest of the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership countries, in the trade deal that we helped get across the finish line. And so now U.S. agricultural exporters face the same old high tariffs, but all their competitors are getting lower tariffs. Their exports are cheaper to Japan. That's going to cost, and is already costing, hundreds and hundreds of millions, and will start to cost jobs and farms. And so no progress on that was a problem. And the president badly fumbled the North Korea issue. The Japanese would be happy that he's a little more cautious about claiming victory than he was a year ago in Singapore when he met Kim Jong-un the first time and declared he'd solved the problem when he hadn't. The Japanese are comfortable with John Bolton being the guy in Trump's ear. But his response to the North Korean missile test was to say it's no big deal and it doesn't count, which is just plain wrong. I mean, Bolton said it violates UN Security Council resolutions, clearly, and that's the Japanese view. So he said we only care about the stuff aimed at the U.S. in Japan, when the Japanese said, no, they're supposed to get rid of all of it. So there were some tactical errors. There was bad tone in terms of showing, a solid American front, poor taste in attacking his political rivals and praising his enemies in North Korea. But on the whole, I think the Japanese would be quite pleased.
It's interesting because Shinzo Abe also was the first foreign leader to meet with, at the time, President-elect Trump, which irritated some of our close allies, for example, Brits and others who had a tendency of thinking, hey, we're going to be the first to meet with him. You did mention the maritime strategy, and which is very much, the Japanese were architects of that. Talk to us about how this president is seen and how the United States is seen, because I also want to go back to North Korea in a minute. But first, sort of a foundational basis. You mentioned the trade. TPP was the key. All of these farmers were going to get their goods into Japan, for example, closed to a lot of these sort of high-end products, which tariffs that Japan has always used to protect its own beef and pork industries, for example. How is the rest of the alliance looking at this president and this administration, especially because he is as unpredictable as he is? For example, you talked about John Bolton. There's a lot of consonance between many in Tokyo and the National Security Advisor, who's hawkish, for example, on China, but also on North Korea. And then the president undermines that very National Security Advisor. Talk to us about sort of the bigger implications here and how all of the nations in Asia are looking at the United States, the centerpiece of that relationship, when so many other pieces of the relationship are really a little more unsettled, perhaps.
Well, the rest of Asia, Japan, our allies, the rest of Asia, all have somewhat different views of China. But none of them, at least in the surveys we've done at CSIS, none of them want to live in an Asia that's dominated by China. We've done surveys of elites. I've seen surveys of the public all across Asia. When they're asked, you want to live in a world, in an Asia dominated by China, or by the U.S., they'll choose the U.S. If asked, what norms do you support, more elites and more publics are going to choose democracy than the Chinese model of authoritarianism. So the U.S., despite all of our blemishes right now, the U.S. still represents, with Japan and Korea and other democracies, the preferred future for most of Asia. And there are exceptions. Cambodia and other small authoritarian states, at least the leadership likes the Chinese giving them cover. But the attraction from China is money or fear. And so most of Asia, and especially the more significant powers, the Indias, the Koreas, the Australias, want more of the U.S., not less. They want more of us because they need us to counterbalance the Chinese so they can make choices without being coerced by China, using debt traps from Belt and Road, using island building and militarization of the South China Sea, interference in internal affairs and political campaigns in Australia, New Zealand, and Philippines. I mean, they don't like that. And they want more of us and more of Japan and others who they trust more. That's for sure. So in opinion polls, for example, among our allies, Korea, Japan, Australia, support for alliance with the U.S. is very robust, thanks in large part to China. But some of those polls, when the polls ask, do you trust the U.S. to do the right thing? Those numbers have gone way down. So they need us more. They want us more, but the polls suggest they're a lot more nervous about whether they can count on us. And, it's understandable why. We pulled out of TPP, this Trans-Pacific trade deal, which was, from the region's perspective, a great deal for the U.S. that they all signed on to accept more market opening and more rules because of China. And now we're pulling out of a deal that they, had to fight hard to get through.
A particularly hard fight for the Japanese in order to push that through.
Opening agriculture, the sacred cows, if you will, sacred rice bowl. So it's kind of perplexing. They continue to be uncertain about whether or not Donald Trump is an asterisk of history, whether he's kind of a footnote. Oh, and there was Donald Trump. But the rest of the blob, the rest of the swamp, the Congress, the states, the American public, all very pro-engagement. public opinion polls about the United States show more support for engagement in Asia, more support for trade, more support for immigration, more support for alliances since Trump became president. So, all of our friends in Asia are saying, so is it structure? Like, are we okay? Donald Trump himself is a bit of an anomaly, but one will survive because the structure of American interests keeps them engaged with us? Or is Donald Trump the result of something structurally different about the U.S., and from now on, we just can't count on him? We may get a Donald Trump on the left, a Bernie Sanders, or we may get 4 more years of Trump. We don't, these debates are going on in all of our allies' capitals, in Canberra and Tokyo and Seoul. I go to these places all the time. I think they've decided we're not going to bet that this is the trajectory of the U.S. We're going to bet that Donald Trump brings agency or leadership style that makes it very bizarre for us. Not all bad, much more robust on security policy in some ways. But that we're not going to just assume that America's on a trajectory of retrenchment and retreat. So far, nobody is betting against the U.S. But our election in 2020 will be a big indicator. And if Donald Trump gets reelected, what kind of second term would it be? There are a lot of, it's too hard for Australia or Japan or Korea or even in India to say, we can't count on the Americans, let's plan on a world without them. That's just too hard given China's growth. So they're all nervous, but they're all largely doubling down on relations with the U.S. We are not playing a strong hand in many ways, but the Chinese are just, who wants to live with China in charge? And the answer, when you look at the polls, is not most of Asia.
Do you think, you mentioned the fact that the Chinese have been overplaying their hand. We're now engaged in a trade war, and that trade war also is affecting not only people in the United States, but it's also affecting people across Asia. The interdependence of all of these economies is profound. What are the potential security or diplomatic or defense ramifications of the trade war and its effect on some of our allies? And whether, in some cases, does that help China's hand or hurt? What's the dynamic there from your standpoint?
So most of the major economies in Asia are wrestling with the same things with China that we are. The Japanese, for example, invest more in China than we do. They have more at stake economically with China than we do. But they've been ahead of the U.S. in saying we need to decouple from China on 5G. We need to protect these key technologies. The Australians have gone there too. Taiwan is very heavily dependent on China, very heavily invested, but they're starting to diversify their investment towards Southeast Asia and India. So is Korea. So, all of our friends and allies are deeply uncomfortable with China's current economic policies. Everything from intellectual property rights theft to arbitrary demands and boycotts and lack of rule of law and transparency. They're all uncomfortable. And so in that sense, there's a lot of support for the U.S. pulling together like-minded states to impose some tough consequences on China for cheating, which in a way TPP would have done because China wouldn't have gotten the tariff benefit. Hundreds of billions of dollars of trade would have moved from China to countries like Vietnam. That cost would have incentivized the Chinese to reform. Countries want to deal with the China problem. And on 5G, we do have, I think, support from Japan and Australia. India's a little more on the fence. But where we don't have support is the huge tariffs that the president's throwing on China for trade. Protecting national security in the 5G case is accepted by our friends and allies. Slapping huge tariffs is a problem for them because, as you pointed out, the production networks in Asia cross borders. You buy an iPhone, it's not made in one country. It's made in a dozen or 2 dozen countries across the Pacific Rim. And by slapping tariffs on China, the administration's punishing Japan, Korea, Taiwan especially. So they're with us on the 5G high-tech stuff, I think. They're with us on imposing more disciplines and pressure on China to protect intellectual property rights and things. But an allied trade war, nobody's with us. And that's the risk the administration runs, because they're going to end up being an army of one if they're not careful.
Let me ask you about North Korea. The administration every administration has multiple voices, but at the end, the interagency process gets it refined to at least a message that comes out from the administration. The president, this administration has been, I think we can agree, unprecedented in that the president often says things that are completely different from his national security team, and in fact, in contradiction of the facts. I mean, North Korea conducted missile tests, right? What's next on the North Korean front, and how does this disconnect affect how countries in the region that are very concerned that the North Koreans are actually just biding time and rebuilding capability to become kind of a little bit more dangerous in the Pyongyang's game is an extortion game. It's a highly refined game. You and I have talked about this for years, that, they know exactly what to do to, get sanctions lifted, bargain a little bit, improve capabilities, go back hardcore again. How does this entire disconnect and what we saw with John Bolton both tell allies more broadly about our security policy and that uncertainty piece, but specifically what's next with the North Koreans at a time when it's a very, very delicate time and the North Koreans are playing for constant advantage?
First of all, I love the way you characterize the interagency process, because for my 5 years on the NSC staff under President Bush, we had that interagency process. We agreed on a common message. And then John Bolton would go out and say what he wanted to say anyway. So payback's a interesting experience.
Okay, putting that aside, I was going to say that, but I was saying at least that there was at least a unitary view, right? I mean, it wasn't coming from the president.
North Korea's never been easy. No administration's had a unified message on North Korea, but this is a particularly ununified administration when it comes to North Korea, because the president, in the same way he did as a business leader, turns on his own staff and his own deputies to enhance his own leverage as he sees it. I think that the administration deserves a lot of credit, actually, for mounting in September of 2017 the most significant package of sanctions against North Korea that we had seen in decades. I mean, they really put the squeeze on North Korea and did so in a unified way. Treasury, State, NSC, the CIA. I mean, very impressive. The president, in my view, squandered that by talking about fire and fury and war, which was not credible, which scared our allies more than it scared the North Koreans, and then retreating to his self-proclaimed love affair with Kim Jong-un. And what did he get for it? In Singapore, the North Koreans promised the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. The denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is a line I heard in negotiations with the North Korea. It's well known to those of us who've played this game with them. It means we'll give up our nuclear weapons when you give up your nuclear weapons, when the peninsula is, quote unquote, denuclearized by everyone. It's a nothing burger. And the president thought he had solved the problem. Then his very capable negotiator, Steve Biegun, without a lot of support from the president, to be honest, got the North Koreans in Hanoi in the meeting, the second meeting between Trump and Kim, to put something on the table. But what they put on the table was basically what they put on the table to Clinton and Bush, which was the Yongbyon complex, where probably half or so of their nuclear capabilities reside, in exchange for sanctions lifting and a normal relationship. It's the exact same thing they offered Clinton in 94, 95. It's what they offered the Bush administration in 2005, 6, 7, 8. The only difference today is two big differences, frankly. One is there's a lot more in Yongbyon. There shouldn't be. There's more stuff there because they're cheating. And the other difference is that in contrast to the Clinton deal in 94, 95, the so-called agreed framework or the six-party talks process I was involved in under Bush, the other big difference is in those two cases, North Korea said it would get rid of all nuclear weapons. That's not what Kim Jong-un put on the table. You get Yongbyon, we get sanctions lifting in a normal relationship, and you don't touch the rest of our nuclear program was the implied message. But the North Koreans are no longer willing to negotiate real denuclearization. They're very clear about that. So where do we go? Frankly, I don't think we go anywhere. I mean, that's just not a tenable basis for negotiations. I don't think the administration is going to get the big deal Donald Trump wants. They might get a small deal for pieces of the North Korean capability. If it slows it down, it might be worth giving up pieces of sanctions, but a big deal is just not in the offing. And I think if we can invent a time machine, we should all go back to September 2017 and say to the president, you've done more than Bush or Obama or Clinton. You've put the squeeze on them. Keep it on. Talk to them. See what you can get in terms of small deals, traction. But the reality is they're not prepared to give up nuclear weapons, so you have to protect yourself and your allies, slow them down, cut off their cash, cut off their technology. That is probably where we will end up. That's probably where the Japanese expect us to end up. It's probably where John Bolton, the Pentagon, and the State Department, and the NSC all think we're going to end up. It's not where the South Koreans want to end up. President Moon Jae-in is a progressive from the left who is promising, the South Korean people that he will end the nuclear terror from the north. He's in a dream world, frankly. So he's not there, and President Trump himself is not there. But most of the U.S. officials, Japanese officials, frankly, Korean officials, at least the conservatives who know North Korea, think we're going to end up in some kind of containment mode. There will be diplomacy, but we're not going to get the big deal Donald Trump thinks he's already gotten.
Michael Green, Dr. Michael Green
Thanks,
of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, part of the Crack Asia team, headed the Japan program, and also a professor at Georgetown University. It's always a pleasure.
You bet. Thank you.